The Babylonians, the Romans, the Grecians, the Vikings, and even more modern times, the United States of America, the Chinese, the Russians. Which of these has marveled you with their power and their strength in terms of military and technological advancement? Well, history has witnessed the rise and fall of mighty empires, nations that have shaped the course of civilization, governed continents, and forged laws that influenced even our modern world. From the ancient sons of Babylon to the thrones of Rome, and from the high-tech corridors of Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, the pulse of human history has often beat under the rule of global superpowers. But long before the rise of Rome's legions, the Grecian philosophers, and even the technological powers of the USA, China, and Russia, there was a kingdom whose laws were unchangeable, at least per the historical records we have, whose authority stretched from India to Ethiopia, and whose kings ruled with such iron resolve that not even the king himself could revoke his own decrees. That empire is Medo-Persian Empire, a power so formidable that the Bible and even archaeology describes it as a bear raised up on one side with ribs between its teeth, according to Daniel chapter 7 verse 5. The Medo-Persian Empire was a predator of kingdoms, a decisive army in war, which exacts injustice. We see it through history, especially even connected with the book of the Bible, especially within the book of Daniel. God reveals to King Nebuchadnezzar in a vision that foretells the entire sequence of global empires. Clearly, in the chronological order, we see Babylon having the head of gold, ruling from 605 to 539 BC. History continues that the chest and arms of silver of that particular statue seen by Nebuchadnezzar reigned from 539 to 331 BC, represented by Medo-Persia. The Grecian Empire follows, being represented as a belly and the thighs of bronze, ruling from 331 to 168 BC. Then the Iron Monarchy of Rome follows suit, represented as the legs of iron, ruling from 168 BC to 476 AD. Then finally, as we see presented in Daniel, the feet of an iron and clay is what we have come to know as present-day Europe, divided with modern powers. But each of these empires succeeded the previous by conquest and collapse. There is one thing that sets aside the Medo-Persian Empire. It is their legal system, their scale of governance, and their divine role in prophecy. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned as we will discover pertinent issues regarding historical facts and the importance of the Medo-Persian Empire even in our current times. Remember, you are welcome to Steady Insights. Our discourse in this particular episode highlights two very important personalities, women actually, who played important roles in the Bible and of course even currently have reflected to us very important themes needed to understand biblical prophecy: Ruth and Esther. In fact, according to the Bible, they are the only books whose main protagonist is a woman, and they are the two books with two very impressive stories from which we can learn important lessons. Remember, we are still looking at allusions, symbols, and imagery from the Old Testament, especially connected with the historical facts and the importance of historical timeline to understand the future. In addition to their historical and moral significance, we see, and as we are going to discover more, Ruth and Esther have a symbolic value. As women, they did represent, and even now still represent, God's faithful church. They teach us about the plan of redemption and the final episode in the conflict between Christ and Satan. As we usually do, we will link up through this discourse. We will look at Ruth and the plan of redemption. We will ask these questions like, what was lost? Was there a redeemer? And we will climax that part of Ruth with the redemption. Then the counterpart of Ruth, as far as this study is concerned, Esther and the end time, the conflict and the decisive hour. We do believe that the story of redemption is well captured by the story of Ruth. In fact, the whole plan of redemption is well engraved in the day-to-day activities of Ruth and what is recorded about her in the biblical record. Ruth's narrative begins in a famine. It's nothing that is short of mesmerizing, because this was a condition that spiritually parallels humanity's loss of divine presence and provision due to sin. Did you know that the word Bethlehem means house of bread? Well, it is. The name Bethlehem has its etymology to connote the idea of abundance of bread. So in a nutshell, Bethlehem means the house of bread. But the frantic and most interesting part of this whole narrative is that in the context of Ruth's story, Bethlehem lacked bread. Just like Eden, that was once abundant, was replaced by hardship and death through disobedience, as we see through the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3. And with this hardship of famine, with Bethlehem, a house of bread, not having bread, ironically, Elimelech, who happened to be another important vessel for our discourse today, journeyed and had symbolized separation from God, with Naomi's return marking the beginning of restoration. What did really happen and what was lost? Clearly, the imagery of Bethlehem suggests to us that even in the abundance of bread, there could be famine. In this way, the trust of people in God is expected to remain steadfast. Unfortunately, Elimelech couldn't remain steadfast and have trust in the Lord, necessitating his movement, which eventually led to death. Clearly, we see that Naomi's bitterness, of course, she had become a widow, reflects the emotional and the spiritual weight of sin. However, clearly from the narrative, God's providence shines through Ruth's loyal love and Boaz's kindness. The kinsman redeemer, as we have seen, actually portrays a system in Leviticus 25, verse 25. Let me give you a rundown of this very important statement. You see, in the olden biblical times, within ancient Israel's custom was rooted in it family loyalty and responsibility. And what is now known as kinsman redeemer, or in the Hebrew, Goel, was a system that was purposefully initiated to protect family land and property, to also support family members and maintain family lineage. In terms of responsibilities, as a kinsman redeemer, you had to redeem the land that had been sold due to poverty. Again, you had the privilege to marry a widow to produce an heir for a deceased relative. Then finally, in the cases of murder, the Goel or the kinsman redeemer would seek justice for the victim who had been killed or murdered. We could also elucidate key characteristics from this kinsman redeemer, who in our discourse happens to be Boaz, redeeming Ruth from her plight. Boaz happened to have been a typical close relative, and he was to protect and support the family members. Again, his actions were aimed to restore family dignity, property, or justice. Do you know that Boaz in a miniature form was anti-typical of the role of Christ? In the book of Ruth, Boaz acts as a kinsman redeemer for Naomi and Ruth. But in Christian theology and even historically, Jesus is often seen as the ultimate goal or the kinsman redeemer, redeeming humanity from sin and its consequences. Wow! So wonderfully, even in miniature form, the story of Ruth is well connected to the perfect salvific work of Christ. Let me go on and get deeper. The redemption. If you study the narrative of Ruth carefully, it is clear that Boaz faced a legal challenge, a nearer kinsman with prior rights, because this reflected the cosmic legal dispute between Christ and Satan. So it is perfectly displayed in this whole narrative that redemption is secured through a public transaction at the city gate. How do we connect that to Jesus Christ's ordeal? It's the same as Jesus securing our redemption publicly on the cross. So the narrative of Ruth portrays the scenario where Boaz had to do a public transaction in order to be able to redeem Naomi and his eventual wife, Ruth. And this is what Christ replicated by publicly having a transaction with his own life for sin on behalf of man. And we see this perfectly revealed, of course, as we discuss in the context of prophecy, heaven's judgment scene according to Revelation chapter 5, revealing Jesus as the only one worthy to open the scroll for our destiny, because he paid the price with his blood. Esther and the end time. Maybe it is important for me to quickly go back to the history of the Medians and the Persians. According to Herodotus, when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he didn't just topple a city. He altered the course of biblical prophecy. In fact, so wonderfully, Cyrus, if not one of the fewest, is the only one mentioned by name over 150 years earlier, according to Isaiah 45 verse 1, calling him God's anointed in relation to his role to topple over Babylon. So wonderfully, we see the Cyrus Cylinder, which is now housed in the British Museum, recording his policy of religious tolerance and the return of exiled peoples, even including the Jews. What more about the Medians and the Persians? Historically, we know that his successors, that is Cyrus the Great, Darius I, and Xerxes, who is popularly known as Ahasuerus, which we will eventually know was the ruler during the time of Esther, ruled with supreme authority. In fact, the empire, the Persian Empire, spanned 127 provinces, or otherwise called satrapies, which were governed by scribes, princes, with laws that could not be altered when given. Imagine a legal system so rigid that once a decree was stamped with the king's seal, not even the king could reverse it. And this particular happening stands in stark contrast to modern systems where executive orders can be overturned, parliaments can amend constitutions, and courts can reinterpret laws. Clearly and historically, the Persian Empire was a prototype of centralized bureaucracy and absolute monarchy. It surpasses even the later Roman Caesars in its control and reach. And this explains why stories like Daniel in the lion's den and Esther, as we will delve deeper, before the king carry such intensity. The law was final, and death was often a matter of policy, not passion. But before you get engrossed so much in history, let me bring you back to our discourse for this episode. The conflict. The book of Esther mirrors the final events on earth. Did you know that? You see, when you go through the embers of the book of Esther, you get to know names like Haman, like Mordecai, and even Ahasuerus and Vashti. Haman, like Satan in the end time, seeks to destroy God's people for not conforming to false worship. Then Mordecai stands firm, refusing to bow, just like the faithful in Revelation 14 verse 12, who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. But the decree of death prefigures the death decree against God's end-time remnant. But here is what is to add. Haman's power under King Ahasuerus symbolizes Satan's manipulation of political powers in the end days, and he will work through earthly governments to enforce counterfeit worship and persecution. Basically, history tends to provide a formidable evidence of what we are yet to expect, and that is when we come to the decisive hour. We see that Esther, who is a symbol of the church, is called to stand in the gap. Her moment before the king mirrors our intercessory role in the dying world. There comes a time clearly that we are made or moved and inspired to be the epitome of perseverance. And clearly Esther's fast and courage highlights the role of prayer, readiness, and trust in divine timing, qualities which are essential for the final generation. Clearly, despite irreversible first decree, the second decree empowered the Jews to defend themselves. Similarly, God's people will be spiritually armed through the word and the spirit. Perfectly we see that Purim, the joyful feast of deliverance, which was proclaimed in commemoration of what happened at the time of Esther, actually prefigures prophetically the eternal joy of the redeemed, according to Revelation 7 verse 14 through 17. From Ruth's quiet field to Esther's royal court, we see God's hand orchestrating redemption. In both stories, legal systems, political powers, and personal sacrifice converge under the direction of divine providence. While Ruth points us to the personal story of salvation, Esther magnifies the cosmic conflict and final deliverance. Here is the take home. We, like Esther and Ruth, are called to embrace redemption and stand faithfully in the decisive hour. And we are lucky because history has always tended to repeat itself. The question is, on which side will you stand?